Well, good evening, and welcome to the first of our four-part educational series, Virginia Preservation Academy. I'm Elizabeth Castelny, CEO of Preservation Virginia, and on behalf of our board and trustees and statewide staff, I want to thank you for joining us. I'd also like to share my appreciation with the Department of Historic Resources for helping to organize and fund this series. We're excited to bring this to you. We're indebted to our year-round partnership with the department to preserve the Commonwealth's history. We're grateful to our panel of experts for tonight's program. They have devoted an enormous amount of time to prepare and participate in this discussion. I especially want to thank Sonia Ingram, Preservation Virginia's Associate Director of Preservation Field Services, for envisioning this series as a way to explore the fundamentals of preservation best practices. And if we were all in person, we'd give her a standing ovation. The Virginia Preservation Academy features live lectures by preservation professionals with direct interaction between participants and panelists. Recording of the webinars will serve as a foundation for a library of training videos and available on the Virginia Department of Historic Resources and Preservation Virginia's website. We're grateful to the following sponsors who not only supported this program, but also supported our advocacy during the General Assembly. These include Rick Barker Properties, Monument Construction, Historic Richmond, Linden Capital, National Trust Insurance Services, Glavan Homes, Piedmont Environmental Council, Hirschler, Commonwealth Preservation Group, Genevieve Keller, and Tripp Pollard. A few housekeeping bits. You may ask questions at any time during this session, but we'd ask you to put them in the Q&A box at the bottom of the screen, and we'll do our best at the end of the session to answer as many as possible. For the best viewing option, as we move to our speakers, we'd suggest that if you go to the upper right corner of your screen and select speaker option, that'd probably give you the best viewing. Preservation Virginia is as a certificate maintenance provider by the American Institute of Certified Planners. This program and the next three in the series are eligible for AICP certification. The maintenance credits are 1.5, and they're eligible for each webinar. And the instructions for how to capture those credits will be placed in the chat box for you to grab. The past 2 years have been unprecedented for every aspect of our lives. In 2020 and 21, David Brown, formerly the Vice President for the National Trust for Historic Preservation, facilitated a process with Preservation Virginia's staff and board to revise our strategic plan and vision. With input and dialogue with stakeholders, allies, partners, and activists, we examined how the world was changing and how historic preservation could bring value, economic recovery, and connect communities across the Commonwealth. At the core of that plan are the principles of knowledge and innovation, integrity, inclusion and diversity, and sustainable stewardship to make a difference and get things done. The Virginia Preservation Academy is one example of how Preservation Virginia seeks to expand networks and support local capacity building to sustain Virginia's historic places. This series will continue next week on March 16th, and future programs over the next several weeks will explore the purposes and benefits of the National Historic Register programs, how to research a historic property with tips on preparing a national and state register nominations. And the final 2022 session will be on how to find and hire consultants to assist you in your preservation project. In future, I would suggest you check our website, and I think it'll be dropped into the chat as well for the dates and times of those broadcasts. In future years, webinars will include workshops on rehabilitation tax credits, environmental reviews, grant writing, historic cemeteries, revolving funds, historic highway markers, and preservation easements. We'd also like to have your ideas on what would benefit you locally, what types of programs and what questions you'd like to have us answer. This programming will only be successful if you help us provide that input and also if you participate. So we look forward to seeing you at the next sessions. And now it's my pleasure to introduce Julie Langen. She has served as the director of the Department of Historic Resources and the State Historic Preservation Officer since 2014, having previously served as the deputy director in the department. Julie brings a wealth of experience and expertise to the position, from holding leadership positions with regional and local preservation nonprofits in Cleveland, as well as 2 historic preservation offices, both here in Virginia and in Arkansas. What defines Julie is her passion for Virginia's history and historic places, and her willingness to find solutions that help us all succeed. So Julie.
Thank you, Elizabeth, very much. And on behalf of the Department of Historic Resources, it's a pleasure to welcome so many familiar people to tonight's first module of our training program. Looking at the list of attendees, I wish we were in person, but this is a much more efficient way to provide training and to provide it long-term through the modules that are going to be available online. I'd like to just lead off by, I think it's fair, full disclosure, to say that this idea was not the Department of Historic Resources idea. It came to us from Preservation Virginia, and we're very grateful to Preservation Virginia for this concept. They have done the heavy lifting. We provided some financial support, but they have done all the work, and especially Sonia. So thank you very, very much for that. This just illustrates yet again that DHR could have no better partner than Preservation Virginia, and we thank you very much for that. I'm really excited to hear from tonight's panel of experts who will attempt to demystify historic districts. And understandably, there's a lot of confusion around historic districts. At my last count, there are 4 different kinds. So why wouldn't you be confused? And we're going to address that head on this evening. It's my pleasure first to introduce our moderator for this panel discussion, my friend, Phil Deemer, who is a native of Pittsburgh, but more importantly, president of Preservation Bath. If you don't know Preservation Bath, you should. And if you did, you'd be very impressed. They are an all-volunteer, grassroots preservation organization that's very near and dear to my heart and others on this panel. They have had a profound impact on historic preservation in Bath County. And just a bit more background about Phil. He's just recently retired. That means we can ask him to do even more for all of us working to save Virginia's history. You have more time now, Phil. He's retired from a career in financial investments and management, and along with his wife, Becky, resides in Charlottesville. So Phil, take it away.
Thanks, Julie. I'm surrounded by experts. I'm not an expert, so I'm pleased to have the opportunity to give you a little bit of biographical information on the 3 panelists. And let me start with Dr. Christine Henry. Christine is currently an associate professor of historic preservation at the University of Mary Washington, where she teaches classes in building investigation, architectural history, and vernacular architecture. Recently, she published an article titled "Getting to the Bottom of Ohio's Mysterious Blue Hole." I've got to read that. And in the Journal of the Society of Commercial Archaeology, and co-authored a chapter in the edited volume Contested Pasts, Urban Heritage in Divided Cities. She earned a PhD in Urban and Regional Planning and Design and a Master's in Historic Preservation from the University of Maryland, a Master's of Architecture from Catholic University, and a BA in Art History from William and Mary. Before joining the Mary Washington faculty in Fredericksburg in the fall of 2015, she spent close to 25 years living in Washington, D.C., where she and her partner restored an 1888 row house. And she discovered that her favorite place to learn about the city is from her own front porch. Our second panelist is Greg Rutledge. During his 34 years with Hanbury, Gregory L. Rutledge, FAIA, has helped position the firm as a leader in historic preservation. He particularly enjoys projects with the potential to revitalize communities, such as the Pariserie Community Arts Center in South Boston, Virginia, and preservation planning to save national treasures, such as the historic Fort Monroe. Greg has been honored with the Preservation Award from the Virginia Society of the American Institute of Architects. He is a frequent lecturer on architectural history and currently serves on the Architectural Review Board for the city of Norfolk. Our third panelist, and I hope I pronounced this right, Heidi, is Heidi Siebentritt. Heidi is an archaeologist and historic preservationist. She has been Loudoun County's historic preservation planner for over 20 years. Heidi's work received statewide recognition by Preservation Virginia in 2008, when Loudoun County was awarded the Outstanding Services in Community Preservation Award in recognition of the county's historic districts and interactive website. A distinguished trio, and we're going to start with Christine.
Well, thank you very much, Phil. Let me get my slides going, and I will. All right. So good evening, everyone. It is really a pleasure to be here. I'm thrilled to be able to kind of kick this off. I would say I'm probably not the expert. I'm just going to give you all the big picture, and the rest of the panel are really the experts. But I'm going to start with a little outline for what I'm going to talk about tonight. This is mostly for me, just to make sure that I kind of keep on task. But I'm going to help you kind of define what historic districts are, talk a little bit about the history of how historic districts came about, and then the different kinds of designations that we have, and then spend a little bit more time talking about local historic districts, in particular Fredericksburg, where I'm from, and how they're regulated. So let's go ahead and get started. So first of all, what are historic districts? So, you can see this official definition. They're, a group of building structures, sites, or spaces that have this theme that they share, whether it's historical or architectural or cultural. So what's important is to understand that it is a group of things all together spatially, and they tell a story. So they're in a range of environments, right? We have rural, we have urban, we have suburban, we have all kinds of characters that kind of signify, there's residential, commercial, industrial, archaeological, and honestly, everything mixed together as well. And we define them by their period of significance. So the period of significance is really that time frame in which that theme makes all of these spaces hang together. That might sound like a very limiting thing, but a period of significance can actually be a wide range of years. But it's really a way to be able to say, this is the best way to tell the story with these resources. So I have to put this first in perspective and take a step back and give you a brief history of historic preservation. Of course, I teach an entire semester of this, so this is just one slide, but I wanted to kind of put it in perspective in terms of what historic districts are. So really in the United States, we start thinking about historic preservation in terms of individual structures, what we sometimes call monuments or shrines, really early on. As a matter of fact, Independence Hall is probably one of the earliest, as people start to realize that the founders who were in Independence Hall are starting to pass away, that space is evocative of that history, the time, the place, and the events that happened. So they want to save Independence Hall, and not long after, Mount Vernon is another one that people look to as kind of a starting point for historic preservation in the United States. But those are individual kind of buildings, right? And they really are, I think shrines is the name that they're given. And I think that's a good description for how people see them, right? They're kind of frozen in time, and they represent important things for US history. Now, in the early 20th century, we start to kind of move a little bit into thinking more broadly about saving not just buildings, but saving environments. But we haven't quite gotten yet to historic districts. And really, there's kind of two examples of pretty big environments that get saved right around the same time during the Great Depression. And these are both museum environments. One of them may be very familiar to you all since it's here in Virginia, Colonial Williamsburg, of course, near and dear to my heart, having gone to William and Mary. And then maybe the other one isn't as familiar to you, Greenfield Village. And that's actually a collection of buildings that was put together they were transported to this space, unlike Colonial Williamsburg, which was kind of a clearing away of all of the modern history and a restoration of a very particular time. Greenfield Village is sort of this evocative group of spaces where buildings are moved to a museum environment to talk all about the industrial and invention history in the United States. But those are museums, right? Those are frozen in time. They are not really what we're going to be talking about. And then 1966, the National Historic Preservation Act, I will come back and talk about this a little bit more, but that's kind of the watershed moment when we get federal legislation that creates what we really know of today, including the National Register, the HABS, HALS programs, which are Historic American Building Survey, Engineering and Landscapes, as well as the State Historic Preservation Offices and other things. So that's kind of this broad umbrella under which all of this preservation happens. Now, historic districts actually start a little bit in between this era of the idea of shrines and also creating museums. And really the first historic district that we have in the United States is giving credit to Charleston, South Carolina. So in 1931, also during the Great Depression, Charleston is concerned about the loss of their historic fabric, and they have really challenging circumstances with their economy. And so they create this concept of, instead of individual shrines and certainly preserving, large scale structures, they say what's really special about Charleston is all of these small and mid-sized and large buildings together in an urban environment and what story that tells. And so they create this term called tout ensemble preservation, right? So really just this big environment that makes it feel historic. But the key difference is that this is a living historic environment, right? So the buildings, the spaces, the history is there, but people are continuing to live in them, use them, and even transform them. And so they create this district through a tool of local zoning. And zoning is a kind of new concept in 1931. It's just been tested in the Supreme Court in 1926. And it basically says that local governments are able to designate the uses and spaces that they have in their area. So this is a map of the couple of historic districts actually in Charleston. And just kind of one more kind of explanatory note is what is zoning. Many of you are probably very familiar, but just in terms of this idea of preservation, zoning is about land use planning, and sometimes it's seen as strange. How in the world do we figure out that that is also preservation? It's usually an overlay district in terms of how do we manage those uses. So There are really, I would say, three major types of historic districts, at least in terms of how they're designated, and that also leads to how they are managed. So we'll talk about all three of these in turn. There's the national level of a historic district, and that's the listing on the National Register of Historic Places. You may be familiar with that. There's also the state level, and here in Virginia, that's the listing on the Virginia Landmarks Register. And then there is a local historic district, and places can be actually listed on all three of these lists. And so we'll talk about why that is. So first of all, the National Register. This is established officially in 1966 by the National Historic Preservation Act, the NHPA. And what's really important to know about it is it has no protections. There's no funding, there's no restrictions. Anything that's listed on the National Register, including historic districts, is actually an honorific. I like to say it's like the good housekeeping seal of approval of preservation, right? There's a lot of information, there's a lot of wonderful history, but just listing actually doesn't change anything in terms of how those buildings are saved. The National Register is an inventory. And one thing that people are confused about, the National Register doesn't mean that it has to be listed for national significance. It actually can be on the register for local, state, regional, or national significance. And so that's important to understand, that you can list things for all kinds of reasons and still have it on that National Register, still have it as part of that kind of recognition of your local community. Now, those four kind of levels or criteria of significance, that's how we kind of put them in these big buckets of, why are you telling us that something is listed? So it could be for the events that are associated with it. It could be for the historic people. It could be for the architectural merit, or it could be for the archaeology or prehistoric data. So all of those reasons are reasons that you can be listed on the National Register, and often not just historic districts, but individual sites might have different significances, right? So you might have historic events and people, and maybe even an archaeological significance in the same place. Now, the Virginia Landmarks Register is created actually just prior to the 1966 NHPA, and it is managed by DHR, and it is designed for public education about these resources. And it is actually the same criteria and nomination process as the National Register. What's significant about that is, once again, and it doesn't mean that there's any protection. Both of these are these kind of listings to get a community really surrounding this idea that what they have is something to share, something to value, and is what we like to say in preservation is a public good. Preservation is actually considered a public good that everybody can share when it is preserved. So when you're listing for the state and national registers, how do you go about doing that? It's a pretty straightforward process, but pretty long. And I didn't want to take up all of my time in talking about that. So I did include this link to the Historic Register on DHR's website, which is actually quite clear and really, really helpful. But I like to point out a couple of things that are part of this process. First and foremost, it's about involving the community. Usually any kind of nomination process starts with an inventory, figuring out what you have and what might be significant, and then really educating the community about the process of nomination and what it could do for the community, making it clear that it's not really a funding source, although there are a few things that they might be eligible for later, and then also getting property owners to see what the advantages and what their questions are about it, so that you can get their permission to list. Community involvement is really, grassroots is what this is all about. And then of course, there's got to be tons and tons of research, which is wonderful for preservationists, because then we get to use all of that fantastic research and build upon it And we also look at not just what is out there, what inventory wise, but the integrity of the resources. How well do they tell that story? How much of the material, how much of the setting, all of those things that help us say this is worthy of putting on a register. And you would work with the State Historic Preservation Office, with DHR, to go through this nomination process. So now I'm going to talk about local historic districts. And local historic districts are a little bit different. Local historic districts are like Charleston. They have a lot more power, and they do have the ability to actually approve and oversee changes. This is really significant, and I can't emphasize this enough, that this is where preservation happens. This is the grassroots, right? So local governments or certified local governments, counties and cities and all of those kinds of local government entities can designate historic districts. And it's usually part of a zoning overlay. And as part of that, they have to have an architectural review board. I understand that a lot of our audience are actually members of architectural review boards. So I have to say, thank you for doing this work, because this is really how we make sure that our communities not only are saved, but our communities go into the future and continue to serve as wonderful places to live and work and be. Now, those architectural review boards, they are really charged with overseeing changes to a historic district. And so they might be minor changes, and those usually have a pretty expedited process. I know here in Fredericksburg, we can pretty quickly approve things like signage in our downtown historic commercial area pretty quickly, as long as they've followed all of the guidelines. Fencing in our historic areas is pretty easy to do, but bigger changes like additions to structures or brand new buildings within a district, or even large replacements of materials, they require a public hearing. And it has to be a fair and open process. And that's one of the great things about it being within the local government. It means that everybody gets notified and people can participate in it as much as they want. I thought I would just show you the map of Fredericksburg. If anybody is not familiar with Fredericksburg, you can see that we actually have the Fredericksburg local historic district there in kind of an olive color that's fairly large. And then over to the left, there is the Washington Avenue Historic District, which is a national register district, but not within the purview of our local district, at least not right now. So what that means is all of that olive color is under the purview of our ARB, and the purple area is not. Now, it does happen to be that the folks who live in that purple area also are very conscious of their history and really want to make sure that it's saved, and they're really great stewards of their buildings, but they don't have to go through the ARB process. Now, there's lots of reasons for wanting to create historic districts. So I thought I would just touch on this. And this is not just in Fredericksburg, but this is everywhere. Generally speaking, when people are creating these districts, first of all, they want to protect their properties, the historic properties that they know about, and then through inventory, the ones that they don't necessarily know about. And a lot of times it is also about controlling new development. Sometimes I worry about that term because controlling makes it sound like people don't want new development. It's more about having a say in the new development and having it feel like it's compatible with the old fabric, right? And so this gives that a public process. It also encourages redevelopment and stabilizes and increases property values, because there's a way to know that things are going to change in a relatively consistent way and in a very public way. And then finally, public relations and promotion, that's all about tourism. And being here from Fredericksburg, tourism is really important to us. So inviting people to visit our historic district is a lot of what we do. the regulation of historic districts is really resting on an aesthetic control of the environment. And one of the key features of historic districts is that people in the public often feel like this is subjective, right? That making these aesthetic judgments is not fair and can be biased. So what I like to say is that the ARBs are very careful to not bring in those kind of subjectivity and really use the local guidelines to allow all of these kinds of changes. And they're really changes that are kind of, to sum them up, what's visible from the public right of way. So what you can see from the front. I always tell my students when I talk about historic districts, I live in the historic district and I have a brand new kitchen. I have, the modern amenities, even though my house here is from the late 19th century. The inside has evolved over time, but what everybody sees when they walk past is actually the original elevation. And we all have guidelines and an ordinance to guide how we oversee these. This is the Fredericksburg's Historic District was started in 1972, which is relatively early. And this is our statement on kind of what we are trying to preserve in our historic district. It's a fairly interesting district in that it's both commercial and residential, and is actually a wide range of building styles, building ages, building types. It's pretty eclectic, and it really kind of is an interesting way of saying this collection of buildings is really our local identity, and so we want to save that. Now, what's important to know about local ordinances is they, at their base, are to promote public welfare. And so they have to be both rationally designed and be fair. That means that they can't be onerous or applied unevenly, and they have to work with state enabling legislation that allows them to be created. And the process needs to be as clear as possible, predictable, so that if you follow the rules, it's fairly easy to be able to get things approved. That is ultimately the goal. There we go. The key features of local ordinance are really these two kind of legal words: due diligence and due process. So due diligence being notifying people what's happening and making sure that the community is able to be involved, and then due process is really that that the applicant is able to be heard by the Architectural Review Board and to appeal decisions. Preservation doesn't happen in a vacuum though, right? And so local ordinances do have to work with all of the different municipal agencies. So working with code compliance and transportation and planning to kind of coordinate that this is still a viable environment for everybody and a vibrant place to be. And we do that through local design guidelines. The Secretary of Interior standards through that NHPA, they've established some wonderful guiding philosophy documents. And so that's what our local guidelines are usually based on. And they are based on this idea of figure out what is significant about the building, place, or space first, try to maintain it or repair it if you have to, replace it, and then perhaps alter it. So really, the first thing is try as much as possible to save. Oops. And then just to show you the Secretary of Interior's principles are actually 10 principles, and they really come down or boil down to you're maintaining that historic character of the places and trying to be reasonable about the changes as much as possible, trying to save the story for the future. And then I finish with a couple of images of Fredericksburg. As you can see throughout, I've had all of these historic postcards, and this is a pretty contemporary aerial view. So you can sort of see that things have changed a little bit in Fredericksburg, but they've also been able to stay the same and been preserved. So thank you all so much.
All right, thank you, Christine. I'm going to share my screen now, and we're going to talk about, let's see, here we go. View, let's see, slideshow from beginning. Here we go. All right, can everybody see my screen okay? So thanks again, Christine. That was a wonderful presentation, and actually, I'm going to sort of reinforce a lot of the things Christine said, because I'm going to be talking about serving on our local architectural review board here in Norfolk, Virginia, and the things that we look at, the things we have purview over, and how we address these issues that Christine brought up. So Christine has told us what historic districts are. They're collections of buildings with a theme. They are listed on the National Register of Historic Places, the Virginia Landmarks Register, and they can be listed locally as well. And the criteria that Christine mentioned about being associated with broad patterns of history, design, distinctive characteristics are archaeological sites. So that's sort of the basic, drive the point home again here for you guys. So I don't know how much you know about Norfolk, but it is located here in the center of what we call Hampton Roads, or Tidewater, Virginia. And it was established as a colonial town in 1682. We made borough status in 1736, and we applied for, when we reached a population of 10,000, city status in 1845, and that was granted. And this yellow area is roughly the size of the city of Norfolk at that time. And through a series of annexations from 1887 to 1959, we have the current boundary of the city of Norfolk. Now, the city of Norfolk boundary is fixed because we can annex no more, because Virginia Beach was created and the city of Chesapeake was created in the early 1960s, and Norfolk, unfortunately, well, maybe not unfortunately, I don't think it's unfortunate, Norfolk is landlocked. So our land value and our land usage is very precious here in town. We have 19 historic districts. A lot of people think there's nothing here in Norfolk because the town was burned in the Revolutionary War and suffered, a lot of damage, Civil War, and embraced the bulldozer in the 1960s for urban redevelopment. But we have 19 state and nationally listed districts. Many of those districts are residential, which is fairly predictable. We do have a downtown district. We have a very interesting industrial district along the railroad track that runs to the center of town. And we have a very small, but I'm really proud of it, a small mid-century modern district just next to our arts district as well. And Norfolk is currently in the process of reevaluating and resurveying some of the earlier districts that we put on the National Register. The Freemason Street Historic District is one example, and upgrading that inventory and updating that inventory. And we're also looking for potential new districts beyond the 19 that we have. So we're very active, and we're really tickled that we have this opportunity right now to be able to resurvey the city and take another look at it, because it's been quite a long time since we've had a citywide survey. So we're really, really excited about what's going on with this on our ARB. And it's no surprise that most of our historic districts are within those early annexations. There's no surprise to that at all, because those all happened right around the turn of the century, the turn of the 1800s to 1900s. But we do have some really nice, more modern districts that when you get out into the 1930s and that sort of annexation of town as well. So here's the kind of resources we have here in Norfolk. In the West Freemason Street area, we have a really urban context. It's right next to downtown. Ghent and North Ghent are just to the north of Freemason, and they are full of beautiful, eclectic homes from the early 1900s, as well as Park Place. There's a shot of the commercial district in North Berkeley. Chesterfield Heights and Winona, those classic neighborhoods of the colonial revivals and bungalows. And there's our downtown district, and then one of the buildings in the Railroad Industrial District. So you can see we have quite a collection of things that are listed on our registers in the city of Norfolk. We have 4 locally designated districts. Ghent and North Ghent are listed as one local district. West Freemason Street, East Freemason Street, and the Hodges House, which is a very particular site on the southern edge of town. And these are the 4 districts that our ARB review on a consistent basis, as well as, and again, here's some of the resources that are in those districts, just to refresh your memory. And so the purpose of having these districts is really, like Christine says, is to protect and conserve these areas that have historic or cultural significance, is to encourage thoughtful development and redevelopment that's consistent with the character of these districts, is to prevent the destruction of historic structures or random destructions or arbitrary destruction of historic structures, and to implement our historic preservation policies that we have applied in our zoning ordinances. We also, and here's the process of designating a local district. It's very, very similar to the state and national review process, except it's done locally. Typically, it's a civic lead that comes to our preservation planning staff, realizing that their neighborhood is starting to change, or they see the value, the cultural, aesthetic, and financial value of having a district for their neighborhood. They meet with our staff. The staff has a neighborhood meeting. In fact, my neighborhood Colonial Place just had a meeting with the staff because we are considering this for Colonial Place. They prepare this middle, submit it to staff, and then it goes to the feedback loop if it's complete or not. If it is, it comes to the architectural review board, where we look at the potential of the district, and we schedule the public hearings and get public input over a period of several months, really. And when that's completed, the architectural review board will give its recommendation to the planning commission that this should be a district. And at that juncture, the planning commission will review it. There'll be a public hearing. It'll go to city council. There'll be a public hearing, and then the notice of the decision will be returned back to the applicant. So again, like Christine says, it could be a long process, but it has a lot of opportunity for public input, which is exactly what we want. We want this to be, again, transparent and open, and as in the state and national registers, at least 51% of the property owner support has to be there to make this designation. We also have some overlay districts. We have all kinds of overlay districts in Norfolk, but these are the 2 that are really adhere to or apply to our historic districts. We have the Norfolk and Western Railroad Overlay District and the Downtown Norfolk Overlay District. And again, they have similar sort of verbiage and why they're there: to protect the buildings, protect culturally significant styles, to preserve and enhance the character of the district, protect significant structures from destruction or demolition. But number 3, I think, is the real differentiator here: to encourage uses and activities that will keep these buildings viable and functional and in use. And this is especially important in our Railroad Industrial District. It is a district that is really starting to transform. We have a lot of early 1900s industrial buildings that are being renovated for shops, restaurants, and even apartment buildings, large complexes being renovated for apartment buildings. And without this overlay district, that makes the rezoning of that industrial district very, very difficult. But with the overlay district, there's different sorts of uses that are allowed inside that zoning, the light industrial zoning, that is deemed compatible for that neighborhood. And it is really, really making a huge change in that fairly neglected part of the city, which is right straight through across our city in downtown, north of downtown. So what is the Architectural Review Board? So we act as a planning advisor for the Planning Commission and City Council. And we also adopt historic preservation standards. And we review the boundaries of historic districts, and we administer the zoning regulations through the code reviews, or what I should say is project reviews. We are not a code enforcement agency for undertakings inside these overlay districts and our historic districts. Our board is made up of 9 members. We currently have 3 architects, an architectural historian, a landscape architect, a real estate developer. We have 2 residents who own property in those districts, and we have 1 member of our city planning commission acting as a liaison on our board. So that is our board. We have to have 5 folks at a meeting for a quorum. our meetings are open to the public, and it's been really kind of neat. Since we're doing everything virtually right now, we have people who just log on and watch our meetings, which before they were at City Hall, on the 10th floor of City Hall, unless you were coming to present your project or to really speak about a project, we would hardly have anyone from the public at our meetings. So that's how we have our public awareness, is our meetings are wide open to the public, and they can come in, and that we have opportunities for the public to comment for every application, and also at the end of the program in case somebody wants to bring up something like, hey, how do I get my neighborhood as a local district? What do we review? Similar to what Christine was saying, we review exterior changes to historic structures from the public right-of-way, reviewed from the public right-of-way, and that includes landscaping. If you're going to change your front yard, and the amount of hardscape versus softscapes, that sort of thing, not just planting flowers. The roofing materials, the windows, mechanical screening and fencing, new construction in the districts, alterations, additions, and we also have a review over buildings that are being proposed to be taken down. The last one I kind of put in there is kind of a little joke, because we do not review paint colors. We are not the color police, and a lot of people think we have some sort of oversight over if they can paint their house green or not. We do not. We do not. All of our decisions that we make regarding the applicants are based on the City of Norfolk's Historic District guidelines, and I will show you some examples of what we have in our guidelines here in a minute. And what don't we review? We do not review undertakings that are not visible from the public right of way. So if you wanted to put a doghouse in your backyard and nobody could see it, we don't need to review that. As Christine said, if you want to put a modern kitchen in your house, we don't need to review that. Only if it has some sort of impact on the fenestration or the exterior of your home. Ordinary maintenance, general maintenance, painting, repair, things like that. We don't need to review that. But the red flag here is replacement of building elements. If a building element is to be replaced, and you're proposing that it be replaced with a substitute material or something that is not like in kind, then the Architectural Review Board wants to see that and see how that is being treated and see if it's a compatible material for the structure and for the neighborhood. And then ordinary yard maintenance, like I said, just if you want to plant a flower bed, we don't need to review that. And again, we do not review paint colors. So Sonia asked if I would share some of the things that we do see often on our review board. And so I went back about a couple months ago. We had a really good agenda with a variety of different kinds of projects on it that sort of ran the gamut of the things we see. And we are charged for reviewing a lot of things beyond just the historic districts. We are charged for reviewing any kind of, if the city sells property, then whatever is built on that property, we get a chance to review that. New public buildings such as pump stations, fire stations, things like that, we review those. So we have a duty to perform beyond just those historic districts and historic overlay districts. So our agendas can be quite extensive. We meet twice a month, every month, except for the months of November and December. So, and we usually have several items on our agenda for every meeting. But this is one of the examples that we saw a couple of months ago. A beautiful house in Ghent that unfortunately had a fire, and the family that owned it was meticulously restoring this building. That's why you see the scaffolding on the left-hand side picture. They wanted to sort of finalize the restoration of this house by putting the front porch back on, because at some point it had lost its front porch, and this sort of Jacobean entrance thing was added to the house. And we're really lucky here in Norfolk that we have lots of great photographs of these neighborhoods, lots of great property records with photographs of these houses at different periods. So getting photographic documentation, which is so helpful to the ARB, is fairly easy, and we're so grateful when applicants take the time to do that. And this is the sort of thing we like to see. We like to see these kinds of drawings to give us enough information that we know exactly what's planned, what is being proposed for this addition or new construction to this house. And in this particular instance, we did approve this for a certificate of appropriateness, but we did ask them to make some slight modifications to the columns to make them a little less chunky and more fittingly portioned to the size of the porch in the house. But we approved this with a condition, which was something we do quite often. The other one that we saw was a repair project, and this was where they were repairing and replacing materials that were very significant to the house. The copper work, you know, the pieces of the
Give it a few minutes, but it looks like Greg has lost his connection. So I think maybe what we will do is if Heidi is ready, Heidi, do you want to go ahead and give your presentation and then we'll see if Greg can come back on?
Sure. Let me get it lined up here.
Can you hear me?
Greg, do you want to continue? Because I went ahead, they asked me to go ahead and put mine up, but I can take it down. If you want to continue.
Greg, yeah, Greg, do you want to go ahead and finish yours?
Yes, can you hear me?
Yes, we're fine. We're good now. Go ahead.
Okay, I apologize. I somehow got kicked off
That's
of our
okay.
server here in the office. I apologize. I'm so sorry. So okay, slideshow. Okay, slide. So this is one where the applicant was coming back with all the right materials. We like to see the materials at the review board, but since we're meeting virtually, we get photographs of the materials now. So they were coming back with all the right materials. So this was, you know, an almost instant stamp approval. The interesting about this one is we were talking about seeing things from the public right of way. So we had photographs of the rear of this house because it faced on a park that you could see from, and you could see the back of the house from the public right of way. So that's why we have photographs of the rear of this house. We review a lot of signage, and this was a proposal to add some signage to the moon gates at Friendship Park, which is our pagoda park here in downtown Norfolk. So this is the kind of thing we see all the time, where they show us how the sign is going to be created and superimpose it upon the building, so we get an idea of the scale of the signage. This one we did recommend for a certificate of appropriateness. However, we had one member on our board who was very knowledgeable about Oriental architecture and said that something like this would never, ever be on one of these moon gates. So she voted against it. So sometimes we don't vote in unison, and there's sometimes where our votes are like 4 to 5 on projects. So we professionally agree to disagree at some points on projects.
Greg,
yes.
You're not sharing your screen. Could you try to share your screen again? No one can see your presentation. Thank you.
Okay. Oh my goodness. Let me minimize this. Screen share. Okay. How about now?
That's good. Thank you.
Okay. All right. So that was let's go to the project. And then at the same meeting, we had to review a brand new construction, a fire station that was being built, not in a historic district, but in another overlay district. And again, it's a public project, so we had to review those as well. So that's kind of the gamut of the things we see at any particular meeting. And what do we use as our sort of our base knowledge for this? We have historic district guidelines. In fact, We have historic district guidelines for the Ghent and Freemason Street district, and we have district guidelines for the Railroad district because they are so disparate in character and style. And we use these as the backbone for every decision we make. So we are not arbitrary at all in how we make our rulings or our recommendations to City Planning Commission or for certificates of appropriateness. And what I like best about these, and Christy mentioned this as well, is they are totally based on the Secretary of the Interior standards for rehabilitation and use a lot of information from the National Park Service's preservation briefs. So they are sort of the state-of-the-art preservation manuals that we've incorporated into it. The kinds of things that are in our guidelines is what is a contributing structure, what is a not contributing structure, new construction. We have lots of diagrams and drawings so we can graphically try to convey upon the applicant what is good, what is bad, what to follow, what is not to follow. We have a decision tree for substitute materials, which is fairly common. You know, if it's still available, if it can be repaired, if there's somebody who can work on it, and it's not a financial burden, then yes, use that material if you have to replace it. But if it can be repaired, repair in place. And if any of these things go to no, we will consider a substitute material, but we also consider it, is the material compatible? Is the material, has the same character? So we still have, rules we go through when considering substitute materials for our districts. We have sections on roofs, exterior walls and trims, doors and windows, porches, balconies, storefronts for our downtown area, landscape site improvements. We even had outdoor dining guidelines for the dining district in downtown, some sustainability guidance as well. One of the things we are lacking, these are fairly old, is resiliency. And I think we are in the process of looking at these guidelines and making some revisions to it. And I think since we're in a very vulnerable coastal zone, that resiliency should be a really important part of our guidelines, especially as we're starting to see people raise houses like 9 feet up off the ground to get them out of the flood danger. And then we have relocation and demolition. Oops, that's the wrong way, sorry. And we also have other documents that we rely upon as well. We have these wonderful neighborhood pattern books for the city of Norfolk. They are not our district guidelines, but they give us a wealth of information about how to identify the character of these historic structures and the character of historic neighborhoods. And so we rely on those a lot as well to understand what components of the buildings are important to maintain, to identify, maintain, and preserve. Our process is similar to what Christine showed. You file for an application, the staff works with you, it comes to the architectural review board. It's an open to the public meeting. We make our recommendations. It goes to the City Planning Commission. City Planning Commission goes through basically the same process. If everything's approved or approved for conditions, a certificate of appropriateness is issued. If it is denied, the applicant has the option of altering the proposal or appealing to City Council. City Council has the option to overturn our decision or uphold our decision, and then the applicant has also the chance to go to circuit court if that outcome comes. I have been on our review board for maybe 6-7 years, and we've only denied 2 applications. So it's rare that we will deny an application. So that is a quick overview of Norfolk's Architectural Review Board, how we're composed, what we look at. I apologize for the technical difficulties, but thank you very much. And with that, I am going to turn it over to Heidi.
Thanks, Greg. I appreciate it. I'm going to just queue up my presentation here and see how technologically savvy I can be. So I'm going to be talking about, assuming everybody can see my screen, I'm going to be talking about
Not yet.
Oh, no. Oh. All right, how about that?
You've got it now.
All right, we start from the beginning. Thank you. So I'm going to be talking about Loudoun County's rural historic districts, and I'm going to be focusing actually on one historic district in particular. But as you all have heard, and being the third presenter means I'm going to be the redundant presenter, so apologies in advance. But as we've already heard, the local district designation is really the only tool that localities in Virginia have to regulate historic preservation. And we know that outside of a locally designated historic district, a property owner can alter or demolish a historic structure no matter its significance. The local designation provides a mechanism for localities to review and approve or deny alteration, demolition, including demolition by neglect in historic districts through an appointed architectural review board. As you've heard in Loudoun, that architectural review board is called the Historic District Review Committee, or HDRC. And that's a shout out to the HDRC members who were on the on the session this evening. Design guidelines for local districts are the standards, as you've heard, that architectural review boards use to evaluate proposed changes to buildings, and in rural districts also propose changes to the landscape. So most review boards, and Loudoun's review board actually, HDRC, is quasi-judicial. So it doesn't make recommendations, it actually makes binding decisions that are only appealable to the local governing body, and it's a big job to do that. But I think it's also important to note, as has been noted before by Christine, that local district designation is not meant to freeze a community in time or stop development. Rather, it's a tool, and it's really just one tool that, in conjunction with other things, localities can use to manage change in a way that ideally respects the historic rural character of an area. And in the case of rural districts, again, can also help preserve farmland and open space. And I'm going to talk a little bit about that in the coming slides. But since it's International Women's Month, I would be remiss if I didn't just mention the Mothers of Preservation in Loudoun County. And we can't really talk about historic zoning in Loudoun without talking about Vinton Pickens, who was the chair of the first Loudoun County Planning Commission, and who was very concerned with the impact of billboards along the county's roadways and the impact that they had on the rural historic character of the county. And so she led a charge to create our first ordinance, which banned billboards, and that ordinance stands in effect today. No, there are no billboards along Loudoun County's roadways. In the 1970s, it was Jean Brown who really picked up the baton, and she was a real early advocate for conservation easements. She was one of the founders of the Goose Creek Historic District, which I'm going to talk about this evening. And she really understood very early the link between rural historic district designation and possibility for farmland preservation. So in Loudoun, we have a fairly long history with historic districts, just as Fredericksburg does. We established them, began establishing them in 1972 as well. And all 6 of Loudoun's locally designated historic districts are rural in nature. They're composed of or contain rural unincorporated villages in the western part of the county. Our most urban historic districts are located actually in the county's incorporated towns of Leesburg, Purcellville, and Middleburg. And because they're in the incorporated towns, they have their own historic ordinances. The towns have their own guidelines, architectural review boards, and awesome staff. And that's a shout out to Lauren Murphy in Leesburg. So all of the county's districts are listed in the Virginia Landmarks Register and the National Register. And we also have 2 districts that have national landmark status as well. But I'm going to really focus on one district that is consistently the most dynamic in terms of growth and change, and that's the Goose Creek Historic District. It's over 11,000 acres. It's by far the largest district in the county, and I believe it's still the largest locally designated historic district in Virginia. And so when we think about infill development, think of what that means for 11,000 acres of lots of open rural land. As you can see, the local district boundary, which is the shaded orange area, is smaller than the National Register boundary for Goose Creek. That's the red outline. And I want to point that out because it illustrates later on the difference between local and national designation and the effects of those two different types of designations. And you're also going to notice some holes in the local district boundary, and I'll touch briefly on that as well, because it's the bane of my existence. Oh. So the Goose Creek District was created in the 70s, and it was created as one tool that residents used to actually stop the Army Corps of Engineers from damming the Goose Creek to create a reservoir that would actually serve Fairfax County. And the reservoir would have submerged the small historic village of Lincoln and the surrounding farmland. And this was an area settled by Quakers in the mid-18th century. So at this time, Loudoun's growth really hadn't started taking off yet. And this area was composed really of thousands of acres of undeveloped farmland that was still supporting crop and dairy production. And it was dotted with the stone and brick farmhouses, the traditional Quaker architecture, and also some modest early to mid 20th century homes. There was really no understanding at the time the district was created of the residential growth and the sprawl that was going to come to Loudoun. At the same time that the community petitioned the board to create the Rural Historic District, it was also petitioning the state to designate Goose Creek a scenic river. And that was also in an effort to stop the Army Corps of Engineers from damming that river. And I should note that they were successful in stopping that project, or we wouldn't have a historic district. So to create the district, John Lewis, who was a Virginia Historic Landmarks Commission, now DHR, architectural historian, he was a Loudoun County resident, and we're so fortunate that he was, because of John, and then of course David Edwards. Loudoun is probably the most surveyed county in the state. So to create the district, John literally took a USGS quad map, and with Gene Brown and others started to draw a boundary for the Goose Creek district. And remember, the main goal of the district at the time was to stop the Army Corps of Engineers from flooding the entire area. So the boundaries of the district really took into consideration the topography, took into consideration the hydrology, and of course the historic farms that were there. And as you can see, the zoning map that was adopted to the right, I think it's actually, I always joke that it's on vellum or, you know, some sort of hide because it's so old, but it has holes, it has voids in it. And the black and the red outline was the proposed boundary of the district, and then the yellow shaded area is actually what the Board of Supervisors designated as the historic district, so as the boundary. So this is a reoccurring theme in Loudoun, where the board establishes historic districts that have voids in them. It's really based on property owner preference at the time a district is being created, instead of actually the resource that the district is supposed to protect. So that is difficult sometimes to administer for the Historic District Review Committee and for staff. So I want to go back to the map that shows the National Register boundary and the local district boundary. So as we've discussed before, the local historic zoning is an overlay zone. So it is on top of the base zoning, if you will, of a property. And the historic zoning designation doesn't change how a property can be subdivided, and it doesn't change how a property can be used. Doesn't have anything to do with the use of the property. But it can, and in the case of Goose Creek, it did dissuade the type of suburban style development common in eastern Loudoun and in other parts of Loudoun and really all over the country, which are the large subdivisions where all of the houses are identical. So the green box that you see in the north shows a Toll Brothers development, which is right outside the local boundary, but it is, as you can see, within the National Register boundary. The local historic districts are just not conducive to this type of development, and so they tend not to occur in the locally designated district. And this is because, of course, this type of development can't meet the design guidelines that call for massing and materials that have some connection to or compatibility with the historic built environment that's there and that characterizes the district. The basic Toll Brothers product that is just outside the local district boundary that you see on the screen, for example, could not meet the design standards in the district guidelines where vinyl siding in our guidelines is prohibited. Roof lines must have a traditionally pitched gable, and fenestrations should echo the simplicity and the symmetry of the existing historic architecture in the district. So I will note that there are other subdivisions in the Goose Creek in the locally designated district. There are 2 of them. They are large homes on 3-acre lots, and they feature individual custom homes rather than the kind of what we would call tract housing, like a Toll Brothers development. Or they have a design palette where the HDRC has approved 7 or 8 specific designs, and then those are used within a small subdivision. But from a land and view shed conservation standpoint, you can see that the rural historic district designation has really been important in this part of Loudoun County. So the lack of subdivisions and the preservation of large parcels of land in the Goose Creek district do present other challenges. And especially since the county has grown exponentially since 1977, when this district was first created. By far in Goose Creek, new residential construction is the most prevalent issue before the county's Historic District Review Committee. And if a person, of course, has the wherewithal to buy in Loudoun County a 20 or 50 or 100-acre tract, you know that they are going to build a very, very large house on that parcel. And so how does this type of architecture blend into the rural historic district? This is actually on the screen an example of something that our Historic District Review Committee is going to look at their Monday meeting. So in a rural context, 2 things are really the most important, and that's siting and form. So Goose Creek's design guidelines stress preserving natural landforms and siting homes into the topography rather than at higher elevations, and then siting within and against existing tree cover, tree stands to preserve views from adjacent historic properties. So form is another important issue in the rural district. So in a rural context, making sure the form, mass, and building materials are consistent with historic precedent is important, because these are the aspects of the house or the elements that may be visible on the landscape from the public road. And I've already discussed that historic district zoning is zoning, and it's meant for the public welfare. I will mention that in Loudoun, the Historic District Review Committee doesn't just look at what's visible from the public road, but in our rural context, when you are looking at houses that are sited well off the public road, as you can see here, it may not even be visible from the public right of way. It's not those individual design architectural elements that become important. It is really just siting and keeping the form consistent with what's there. So our original historic district guidelines really never anticipated the type of monumental architecture that was coming to Loudoun County. So we did update them in 2008, and they probably need to be updated again, but we updated them specifically for Goose Creek to address this phenomenon of these very large residences coming before the Historic District Review Committee. So I also just wanted to touch on one other type of rural district that we have in the county, and this is the Beaver Dam Historic Roadways District. Nobody's actually talked about this. It is a type of local historic district that we do have in Loudoun. We just have one of them. This is the Beaver Dam Historic Roadways District, which it's a linear historic district. It's comprised of 32 interconnecting rural roads in the southwest area of the county. And the zoning overlay is 35 feet on either side of the center line of the road. So Loudoun has over 300 miles of unpaved roads, I think more than any other jurisdiction in Virginia. And this district was actually created by property owner petition, as all of our historic districts are actually presented to our Board of Supervisors by the property owners, to promote the preservation of the historic roadbeds and bridges and the important elements along the road, such as the stone walls in Loudoun County. We have a lot of stone walls lining the roads, as well as tree canopy. So this is a hard district to regulate as a zoning district for the county for many reasons, and that's not the least of which is that the county doesn't really have control over the historic rights of way themselves, the roadbed. That VDOT has that control. Another challenge is in Virginia, localities can't regulate trees. So that's also difficult when you've got something like that in a zoning district. But what this district did do for the county and also for the residents is, its establishment really gave Loudoun and the property owners a real seat at the table with VDOT when road improvements, road widening, alterations to historic bridges, paving, or even tree cutting is planned by VDOT. The local VDOT representatives know that they need to reach out to the community as they plan their projects and get public input. The district is not on the National Register, but I would say that Loudoun's rural road network has been deemed eligible for listing through a preliminary information form on the National Register, as well as a well-preserved transportation network. So the whole rural network of roads in Loudoun County is eligible for the National Register. But starting with one road, our Snickersville Turnpike is actually going to be considered for individual listing by DHR this month. It may have already been, because I don't know the date of the meeting. So we are excited about that. I also just wanted to last talk about what we're looking at now in terms of how local district designation, rural district designation can help preserve other types of communities. So there are 13 documented historic African-American communities in Loudoun. In the western part of the county, they really remain remarkably intact. But that's changing every day because land ownership is changing. And these late 19th to, and early 20th century homes are being demolished so that larger homes can be built on those parcels. So Willisville, shown here as a National Register historic district, but of course that doesn't prevent the loss of its architecture. So we are looking now with the community to see how local historic district designation and other planning tools can help preserve these landscape and communities like Willisville. So often I hear that Loudoun is way ahead of other jurisdictions with historic districts. And that's because we did start early. And our historic districts were created really before Loudoun became the wealthy Washington suburb that we all know it is now. And to be clear, it's not because the county government or county staff have been visionaries all this time. It's because residents in the county organized early. And they pushed elected officials to protect their villages and the farmland and the open spaces. And that started in the 1940s, and that tradition continues today. There's still a very well-organized preservation and conservation constituency in Loudoun County. Residents are still pushing the county to take these really bold steps to preserve ag land and open spaces and villages and other types of heritage resources. So, I mean, in Loudoun, we found that rural historic districts are most effective in conjunction with strong policy development, consideration of the underlying zoning of an area, and in conjunction with conservation easements, which are really the best tool to preserve heritage resources and land in perpetuity. And all historic designations, no matter what level, national, state, local, are really helpful to localities when they're developing policies and they're writing plans. Because if an area is on the map, it's understood that the place matters, and that policy and zoning should reflect that that place matters. And that's what I got. Thank you.
I think we're ready for questions and answers. And first of all, Greg and Heidi and Christine, it was wonderful. I learned a lot, and I think we're going to learn some more from the answers to the questions. I think I have one for each of the three of you, and then I have a fourth that I don't exactly know who should answer this. Maybe one of the three of you, maybe Julie. Let's see. We'll start with the ones for the three of you. Greg, you mentioned overlay districts and historic districts. Can you explain what the difference is?
Actually, maybe trying to oversimplify this because it can get quite complicated. The Ghent and Freemason local historic districts and East Freemason historic districts are actually considered overlay districts as well. They are residential zone districts, but they have this historic overlay over them that makes them the local historic district. And that overlay also allows for some changes in uses for buildings and adaptive use for buildings that could potentially not be allowed in a straight residential zoning area. So it's really the same in our situation. Our historic districts are overlay districts over the base zoning planning.
Great, thank you.
I hope that helps.
And Heidi.
It can be very complicated.
And Heidi and or Greg, but I think Heidi. What are the qualifications for being a member of an architectural review board? Do you have to live in the district and or the city or the county?
So I think the answer to that is that it's probably different depending upon what jurisdiction you're in. So Greg put the specifications for their architectural review board on the screen earlier. Ours are very similar in Loudoun County. Want a composition of some preservation professionals, architectural historians, architects. We currently have 3 architects on our architectural review board, which is wonderful. We also have members of residents who actually live in the historic districts who don't necessarily have an architectural history or an architecture background, but actually who have lived in the districts. And we've also had in the past people who, like Jean Brown, who have been really instrumental in creating historic districts. So every jurisdiction is different. It's written in the zoning ordinance what the specifications for each jurisdiction is.
Okay. Life is always different. Bath County, I can tell you for sure, is different than all the rest of the state. Okay, Christine, you're the academician. Question is, Europe is older and has been preserving buildings for a longer time. How has that influenced preservation in the United States?
All right, so it actually has philosophically influenced the United States, and then also we've kind of departed from the way that they've implemented preservation in European countries. So the short answer is there are kind of two, I like to say there's kind of two poles of 19th century European preservationists. And one is Ruskin, and he's working in England, and he comes from a fine arts background, and he is very interested in preservation in terms of freezing things in time. He really feels like preserving things by restoring them is taking away the beauty that time has influenced. And he's also sort of radical in that he advocates preserving ruins. You know, don't fix it up, don't restore you know, these ruined churches. You know, leave them as they are and enjoy them as they are and stabilize them, because anything we do in the present would, you know, take away from that experience of the past. On the other kind of polar opposite is Loudoun, who is an architect. And so he says, well, we do lots of research and we can certainly restore and then take it into the present day and make it even better. And as an example, of course, he did the most recent before the current restoration of Notre Dame in Paris. So he added the steeple, which unfortunately was destroyed. And there was a lot of debate actually in Paris about, you know, well, what would Viollet-le-Duc think? You know, should we restore it as exactly it was, how he had it, or would he want us to take it into the future, right? So these are kind of the poles of European preservation, and the way that they do preservation is actually, I would say, a little bit more nuanced in practice than how we do things. So we divide things by national, state, and local significance, but most European countries also have a grading system. So they have things that are essentially things that they say, these should be frozen in time. These are so important that we really don't want to change them at all. And different countries call them different things. And then they have various levels of things that, you know, some things can change, and you can, you know, kind of move these into the future more than others, that more change in material, change in use, change in overall buildings. What's significant about them is kind of their contribution maybe to a community as opposed to as a single art object. And we kind of, I would say we almost treat everything the same, and it's more at least in our legislation. And then in practice, we do sometimes distinguish between things that are, you know, artistic and we don't want to change at all versus, you know, like I say, my house, I have modern plumbing. It was not built with modern plumbing. My current house is from 1887. And I can show you the Sanborn maps. It had an outhouse. I don't have that anymore. So we allow, you know, we allow modernization, but in the way that we present it, we don't actually have these standardized kind of grading system. So Europe has influenced us, but we also have kind of made it our own.
Everyone's going to think you knew that question was going to be asked. Yeah, that was amazing. Thank you. Okay, here's the tricky one, and I don't know, and again, maybe Julie, whoever wants to jump in on this one, I'm going to read, make sure I get it right. For a low-income homeowner needing to replace her failing slate roofing, are there localities that provide financial assistance? If not, are exceptions allowed to allow a less expensive roofing material?
I don't know that I'm the best person to answer that because it's asking about what localities have available. And I know some have tax abatement programs. I don't know about grant programs. I'll just say before passing it on, I live in a house with a slate roof and I worry about what I will do if my roof ever needs to be replaced. So I would like to know the answer to this question as well.
In Norfolk, we do have a couple of programs for that kind of assistance. Just as Julie said, a tax abatement program, and I believe the other one is a grant program. So we address it in that way. And I don't want to make this sound elitist or anything like that, but most of the things that we review on our architecture review board are in historic neighborhoods that are very affluent. So that doesn't really come up as an issue for our review. But if it happens in a neighborhood, you know, someone can't afford to replace their slate roof with slate, we would never even know that.
And I mean, I can answer from the Fredericksburg perspective, in that we do have, Fredericksburg is much smaller, I would say, than most of the other places that we've been talking about today. But we do actually have a small fund. And so when people, when it's clear that they're having trouble maintaining a historic property that's within the district, sometimes we will actually reach out to them and say, you know, there is a fund. We also, our local historic Fredericksburg Foundation, Inc., HFFI, was kind of started on that idea of a revolving fund. So sometimes they can help them find funding. So, you know, it's a small place, and it's only a single historic district. So we are able to kind of be a little bit informal and reach out to folks. As my bio said, I came from DC, so I can tell you that, you know, living in a big historic place, there are also tools like that as well. I think they're usually grassroots and individual. In DC, there was both an application to say that it is beyond somebody's ability to replace in kind, and usually that triggers a whole bunch of opportunities for other funding. So it's usually a very individual locality kind of thing.
I think that's all the questions that I've seen. So I'm going to pass back to Elizabeth and Julie. Thank you.
Actually, I would love to kind of jump in for a little bit. And there's a new question, it looks like, that came in too that I might answer. But I thought I might clarify a little bit in terms of the historic district versus an overlay district. So a historic district is just a designation of an area, and it depends on whether it is a national, state, or a local district, whether it becomes an overlay district, right? Because an overlay district is something that goes on top of your zoning so that you have, you know, what we love to call teeth, right? There's enforcement of decisions. So a historic district can just be a designated area, or it actually can be an overlay district, which means there's enforcement power, there's decision power that goes into it. So it's the same if it's a local district, but if it's a state or national district, it depends. It may not have any enforcement quality. So that's, I would say that maybe is the distinction.
That's a very good point. Very good point indeed. That's exactly where our teeth are in the overlay districts.
And there was another question. I apologize. It is why not approve paint colors? Surely some colors are not historically appropriate.
At some point, we just decided we weren't going to be the color police. You know, it's a personal choice, and it's a coat of paint.
I would also argue that what we're trying to do in historic districts and with architectural review boards is preserve the significant aspects of buildings. So if the color is significant, and I always tell my students there's two places I can think of where color is significant and you want to regulate it. The first one are the Painted Ladies in San Francisco, right? They're known for being colorful. Right. And actually the other one is the one that I showed at the beginning of my presentation, which is called Rainbow Row, which is a portion of Charleston. Once again, they're known for being colorful, and therefore regulating the color keeps that historic story, but in lots of places it doesn't, you know, it doesn't contribute in the same way. And it does become much more contentious than it needs to be if it's not a significant factor.
I'll just add that when we're reviewing for tax credit projects, we generally don't review paint colors because that's a temporary change. It's not a permanent change. And so it's not something that can't be reversed.
So we've got another question about solar panels. Mm-hmm. And I know that's been a hot topic in different historic districts. So I don't know if you all have any advice.
I mean, I don't know. I don't want to dominate, but I have some thoughts.
So it hasn't been an issue for us for some reason. I don't know why, but we really haven't seen any requests for solar panels in our districts here in Norfolk. So that hasn't been an issue for us.
We in Loudoun have had applications for solar panels, and we do have some guidelines for solar panels. There's typically looking to put those panels not on the front elevation if possible, looking for specific types of solar panels that fit in between the panels of standing seam metal roofs, that sort of thing that can kind of minimize the profile and the overall impact. So we have done some of that in Loudoun.
Yeah, I doubt we would ever allow them on, the primary facade of the building.
Yeah,
I know we would.
yeah. I live in the historic district, and I have solar panels that I installed on our house last year. Yeah, I have some personal experience with it, and I was really concerned about making sure that we follow the guidelines, and a lot of it was about where are they going to be visible from. Fredericksburg, we did something through our food co-op. So there were, I think 5 or 6 of us that all kind of went together through a nonprofit to kind of do the process at the same time. And there were a couple of folks who the ARB did say, if you can move them, 6 inches away from the edge of the roof, then they're going to be less visible and have less impact. Or, if you can kind of keep one of the arrays off of the front elevation, then, the rest of them are fine. I just kind of lucked out in that my house is long and thin, and it's not very visible. As a matter of fact, it's hard for me to get pictures of it. So I have to ask my neighbor if I can come into her yard to take pictures of it. But what I would say is, trying to allow those kinds of things is super important as we are all going forward, right? And so finding creative solutions. We do have a house in Fredericksburg that has those great ones with the standing seam metal that are almost invisible, right? They fit between the standing seams, and you really don't notice them. So I think trying to work with people for creative solutions, and I think contractors are getting more and more aware of how to do that and work within historic districts.
Great. Well, we've exceeded our time period, but I do want to thank all of our panelists for tonight's presentation. And again, thank you to Sonia for organizing this night and for Julie's participation and Department of Historic Resources partnership. We will meet again, same time next week, where we will be, the topic will be understanding national and state historic registers. And so we hope to see you all back at the Preservation Academy series. And thank you. And I hope everyone has a lovely evening. Bye now.
Thank you very much.
Thank you.